For decades leading up to the 1970s, Venezuela's vast oil reserves were largely controlled by foreign conglomerates, primarily US and European companies. While this extraction fueled major industrialization in the West, it laid the foundation for a deeply dependent economic structure in Venezuela itself. This meant that the government's fiscal health was intimately tied to the volatile global crude prices, fostering a deep social reliance on state spending fueled by this singular resource. This dependency was often masked by moderate stability and a democratic veneer, but beneath the surface, the nation was a ticking economic time bomb, waiting for a dramatic shift in global energy dynamics to reveal its structural weakness. The stage was set for a dramatic, yet precarious, transformation. The moment of transformation arrived abruptly in October 1973. The Arab oil embargo, triggered by the Yom Kippur War, fundamentally disrupted global supply chains and sent the price of crude oil soaring from approximately $3 per barrel to over $12 almost overnight. This sudden quadrupling of prices represented an unprecedented influx of wealth into the Venezuelan treasury, marking the beginning of what citizens famously called Venezuela Saudita, Saudi Venezuela. The sheer scale of this monetary shock was intoxicating, giving the government immense fiscal power and fostering a profound belief that perpetual prosperity was now guaranteed. This financial windfall was not treated as a temporary surplus, but as the new, permanent baseline of national income, fueling grandiose ambitions and altering the social contract between the state and its citizens irrevocably. The oil curse had delivered its first, exhilarating, and dangerous blessing. Riding this wave of petrodollars and nationalist fervor, President Carlos Andrés Pérez enacted the nationalization of the entire oil industry on January 1, 1976. This monumental act saw the birth of Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., or PDVSA, the state-owned enterprise intended to manage the nation's most critical asset for the benefit of all Venezuelans. Nationalization was symbolic, a reclaiming of economic sovereignty, but it also meant the government became solely responsible for the technical management, capital expenditure, and volatile market risks previously borne by international firms. The state was now literally the producer, the seller, and the primary beneficiary of the oil wealth. While international experts warned about the dangers of insufficient technological expertise and political interference, the prevailing national sentiment was one of triumphant self-determination, believing that the profits previously flowing abroad would now fuel domestic development. The immense wealth inspired the articulation of a grand national vision, encapsulated by the famous phrase, sembrar el petróleo, or sowing the oil. This idea, originally conceived by essayist Arturo Uslar Pietri, meant using the finite oil revenues to cultivate self-sustaining, non-oil sectors like agriculture and manufacturing, ensuring long-term prosperity. However, the Pérez administration's practical interpretation often prioritized rapid industrialization and large-scale, high-visibility projects over organic diversification. Billions were poured into ambitious, centrally planned ventures in steel, aluminum, and hydroelectric power, designed to make Venezuela a modern industrial power overnight. These projects were impressive in scope, but often suffered from inefficient management, massive cost overruns, and a lack of competitive advantage, ultimately failing to generate sufficient returns or sustainable non-oil exports, thus missing the core goal of sowing the wealth effectively. The petro boom financed a dizzying array of massive infrastructure projects that transformed Venezuela's landscape. The capital, Caracas, became a showcase of modernity, witnessing the expansion of highways, the construction of luxury housing, and the development of the Caracas metro system, an engineering feat completed in collaboration with French expertise. Beyond the capital, ports were upgraded, vast hospital complexes were initiated, and entire new residential areas sprang up, particularly for the burgeoning middle and upper classes who benefited most directly from the economic expansion. These projects aimed to modernize the nation physically, but they also created a highly centralized economic structure, attracting talent and investment almost exclusively to Caracas and its immediate orbit. draining resources and attention away from rural development and existing local economies, increasing regional inequalities while creating an illusion of universal progress. Perhaps the most defining characteristic of the social experiment was the commitment to extensive social spending and subsidies, often referred to as distributive justice in the rhetoric of the time. The government dramatically increased expenditures on education, healthcare, and subsidized food and fuel, making life artificially inexpensive for the general population. Gasoline, in particular, became virtually free, reinforcing a culture of consumption and inefficiency. Crucially, the government sought to appease various social and political sectors by offering generous public sector employment. This rapid expansion of the public payroll, while reducing official unemployment figures, created a bloated, inefficient bureaucracy dependent solely on state coffers. This cradle-to-grave support system fostered a widespread societal expectation that the state would always provide, divorcing citizens from the harsh realities of global market economics. As the state embarked on its spending spree, it simultaneously began to assume massive external debt. Even with soaring oil revenues, the sheer volume of projects, many running over budget, meant the government often borrowed heavily against future oil income, assuming prices would only continue their upward trajectory. International banks, awash in petrodollars recycled through global markets, were eager to lend to seemingly wealthy petrostates like Venezuela. The initial borrowing started conservatively, but quickly escalated, driven by easy access to credit and an overconfident assessment of future revenue stability. By the end of the 1970s, Venezuela's foreign debt ballooned from less than $2 billion pre-boom to nearly $30 billion. This massive liability created an unsustainable structural deficit, turning the nation from a beneficiary of oil wealth into a debtor held captive by global financial institutions. The unintended side effect of this oil euphoria was a classic case of Dutch disease. The massive influx of foreign currency caused the national currency, the bolivar, to appreciate strongly. This made Venezuelan non-oil goods prohibitively expensive on the international market, while simultaneously making foreign imports incredibly cheap domestically. Local manufacturing and agriculture, unable to compete with cheap, subsidized imports, began to wither and decline. The government effectively disincentivized productive, competitive enterprise outside the energy sector. Everyone, from consumers to entrepreneurs, found it easier and more profitable to rely on imported goods funded by oil income. The social experiment, intended to diversify the economy, instead created a monolithic reliance on oil, weakening the foundational elements needed for genuine economic resilience and setting the stage for deep societal fragility. A second global oil shock following the Iranian Revolution in 1979 briefly masked the brewing economic problems. Oil prices spiked yet again, briefly pushing crude past $35 a barrel. For a moment, it seemed Venezuela's risky strategy was vindicated. The money poured in faster than ever. This second boom, however, only fueled the structural imbalances further, leading to even more irresponsible borrowing and spending, especially by provincial governments, believing the boom would last indefinitely. This period represented the absolute zenith of Venezuela's oil power, the moment of maximum confidence and maximum vulnerability. The entire national budget became structurally reliant on a high price per barrel, far exceeding the costs of extraction. Any future drop, no matter how moderate, would prove catastrophic, as debt obligations and fixed social spending had now locked the country into an unsustainable financial architecture. The inevitable reckoning began swiftly in the early 1980s. Global supply stabilized, oil demand dipped due to conservation efforts, and prices began a relentless, prolonged slide. By 1983, the price per barrel had plummeted, creating a gaping hole in the Venezuelan treasury. On February 18, 1983, known historically as Viernes Negro, or Black Friday, the government was forced to take the devastating step of devaluing the bolivar, ending the decades-long fixed exchange rate regime. This sudden financial shock wiped out savings, triggered hyperinflation, and plunged millions into poverty overnight, revealing the catastrophic failure of the sowing the oil experiment. The debt, once manageable on paper, became crushing in reality. The reliance on a single commodity had brought not perpetual glory, but sudden, painful dependence, and the beginning of chronic political instability, marking the end of Venezuela's golden era. The legacy of the 1970s social experiment is profound and enduring. While Venezuela achieved impressive levels of literacy and infrastructure during the boom years, the failure to diversify meant that the state was structurally incapable of handling the subsequent decades of oil price volatility. The massive external debt became a recurring political crisis point, necessitating austerity measures that repeatedly inflamed social tensions. Furthermore, the centralized, state-centric economic model fostered corruption and rent-seeking behavior, as controlling the flow of oil wealth became the ultimate prize for political factions, further eroding institutional quality. The expectation of unlimited state provision, cemented during the boom, persisted long after the money dried up, fueling the political instability that plagues the nation to this day, illustrating the high costs of relying on commodity prices to engineer social change. Venezuela's journey from oil glory to deep dependence in the 1970s serves as a powerful historical warning. It demonstrates that natural wealth, when managed through centralized control and excessive borrowing, can become a liability rather than an asset. The social experiment showed that resource nationalism and ambition, absent fiscal prudence and genuine economic diversification, often lead to cycles of boom, bust, and crippling debt. The lesson remains critically relevant for resource-rich nations today. True prosperity is built not merely on extracting wealth, but on transforming that wealth into sustainable, competitive, human and industrial capital. The echo of the 1970s oil curse continues to shape the geopolitical realities of modern Venezuela. If you found this deep dive into economic history insightful, please show your support by liking this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates.